Welcome back to the Machine Learning Street Talk YouTube channel. Today is the first in a three-part series on the social dilemma. This is the Netflix film which, according to them, explores the dangerous human impact of social networking, with tech experts sounding the alarm on their own creations. I think we take a slightly different view. Netflix is famous for partisan information, whether it's about veganism or politics or goodness knows what else. It's been said that social media games and deranges our attention, but should social media be regulated? Certainly there were naysayers before seatbelts got introduced or before the smoking ban, and no one's seriously suggesting that we should turn the clock back on that now. Is this just the latest moral panic? Could social media actually be a good thing for our society? Society is changing fast, and it's too late to put the genie back in the bottle. But some have argued that this film is patronising, paternalistic, sanctimonious, and created by a bunch of tech bros. In the show tonight, we spoke about the moral hypocrisy of the film. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, how social media giants possibly know everything about you, the addictive properties of social media, and also the differential consciousness or the different realities that people have when they log into social media. We talk about your moral right to self-determination and the monetization on Facebook. We also talk about this interesting concept that they said that AI would overcome our strengths, and in many ways it overcame our weaknesses. But there is this interesting conception that people have of artificial intelligence that's almost anthropomorphic or embodied. And of course, no, there's no such thing as AI. It's just very basic pattern recognition, but apparently it's been enough to derange our attention on social media. We talk about conspiracy theories and fake news and polarization. We talk about how your short attention span can easily be gamed by social media. Is social media good for you? And as Andy, our guest tonight, is a cybersecurity expert, we talk about social engineering attacks and the security of social media in general and whether or not it's safe to have your information in social media. And finally, we talk about the morality of retrospective judgment, whether in 20 years' time you should be morally accountable for things that you did and were recorded in social media. Anyway, this is our Machine Learning Street Talk tonight. I hope you enjoyed the episode because we had a lot of fun making it. Remember to like, comment and subscribe. We love reading your comments, and we'll see you back next week.
Welcome back to the Machine Learning Street Talk YouTube channel. Now today we have a cybersecurity professional, Andy Smith, and I'll introduce Andy in a minute. So next week we've got the founder of the Montreal Ethics Institute, Abhi Gupta. The following week we've got Dr. Rebecca Roach, senior lecturer in philosophy at Royal Holloway, University of London, and some of her interests are in ethics and the theory of friendship. Now, our special guest today is Andy Smith. He's a security professional working in the corporate world. He's also got a YouTube channel on cybersecurity. And there's a great playlist that I've just been looking on his channel called Attack, Detect, Defend. And some of the videos he's got on there are comm hijacking, forced authentication, abusing Windows services, path interception, image file execution, privilege escalation, abusing Windows accessibility features. It's really cool, actually. Andy's put a lot of effort into his YouTube channel. And he also covers the CrinkleCon Security Festival and the Sands Holiday Hack. But anyway, Andy has particular interest in ethics and digital trust, and he's a good mate of mine, and we often have lots of deep discussions around AI ethics and governance and security and so on. But also joining the show is Yannick Lightspeed Kilcher, but he'll be joining any minute now. And of course, we have one of our regular staff members here at Machine Learning Street Talk, Zach Jolst. Zach is a machine learning research scientist at Amazon Web Services in Seattle, and Zach has his own YouTube channel as well, which is the AI Overlords channel, and you will need to subscribe to that channel. Now, today we're talking about the Social Dilemma film. The film touches on many issues and is surprisingly elusive to articulate. One of the quotes in the film actually is that there are only two industries which calls its customers users, the software industry and the illegal drugs industry. Why do people use social media? Recognition, identity, self-presentation, finding your tribe and socializing, escapism maybe. But what are the negatives about social media? It's been said that it fractures our reality and polarizes us politically. Some have even described social media as the cult industrial complex. The algorithms used might inadvertently derange our attention and addict us to the platform. Some have said it's somewhat akin to the climate change of culture, eroding the social fabric and debasing our humanity. There's been an epidemic of teen depression and self-harm and suicides, which have been potentially linked to social media. There are implications for privacy, and social media has been referred to as surveillance capitalism. Does social media undermine democracy and promote propaganda? Some have said that social media facilitates the spread of misinformation and outrage. As social media companies become publishers, how should they define what information should be censored? Should social media be regulated? The monetary incentives are distorted by the choice of advertising as the revenue model. And does social media affect our agency or self-determination? Has the technology become too persuasive? But it's not all doom and gloom. Is this just a moral panic? I remember when people thought that violent films were debasing our society. Social media can help you find life advice. It can land you a job. It can help you build meaningful new friendships online or find your tribe. You can use it to promote your business or brand and possibly even increase your productivity because you can use it as a tool of temporary relaxation and escapism. Anyway, this is our machine learning street talk episode today. And Zach and Andy, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Great to be here, Tim.
Thanks, Tim.
So let's start with you, Andy. What was your take on the film?
So straight off the bat, just in terms of how the film was presented and came across, I felt myself a little bit on edge throughout quite a lot of it. And that was down just to the manner of which that film presented itself. It was very provocative. I very quickly got a feeling that it was designed to tug on certain emotional and psychological parts of my brain. There was some imagery there, so some graphics showing puppetry, and clearly that's quite an emotive image. There was clearly the fictional story of the family in the film, highlighting obviously some of the dangers of social media and some of the bad side. To me, it wasn't necessarily always clear where that fictional story stopped and the factual documentary began. There were some very evocative quotes in there, and you mentioned one in the introduction there, Tim, around only two industries refer to people as users, the drugs industry and the software industry. Again, very, very emotive. And I think that emotive aim was misguided for me personally as a viewer, because whenever I feel like any activity is tugging on my emotions or tugging on some of those psychological cues in my brain, it makes me ask why. And I felt like that devalued the message of the film. For me, I'm a very logical person, a very factual person. And so for me, it made me wonder, how fair is this film going to be? Because most of the time when you see that type of material elsewhere on the internet, and funnily enough, elsewhere on social media, it's because it's trying to push an agenda. So I found it a little ironic that the way this film came across was using some of those same techniques and sneaky ways of manipulation that they, in the film, actually go on to criticize.
That is really interesting because the film talks about persuasive technology. And you could just argue that this is a moral panic. We've had the advertising industry for 80 years or so. And the whole point of that industry is to create uninformed consumers that make irrational decisions. And in the film, they talked about this kind of almost game theoretical adversarial attack that these algorithms use to manipulate your behavior. But as you say, it's really interesting that the film was also presented in quite a manipulative way. Zach, what was your take?
Classic. Yeah, Andy almost took the words out of my mouth. It's exactly what I wanted to say. That to me, the most striking part of the film was the irony that they were perpetrating the same sorts of moral ambiguities that they were calling out in these other platforms. I think that the entertainment industry has a lot of the same incentives as the advertising industry. Like, they're trying to capture your attention. They're trying to go viral. They want you to talk about it. They want you to engage with it. And one really great strategy for doing that is getting people triggered on their deep-seated values and making them feel emotional and scared and panicked and all those things. And this film exactly did that. And to me, it immediately put me on guard to start playing devil's advocate. So I think maybe because people like us have a little more familiarity with these technologies because we work in the industry or adjacent to it, but they were trying to target people presumably that don't have much information, And I think had they taken a really dry, objective approach, it maybe wouldn't have captured as many people. So in some sense, like if their objective is to raise awareness and to get people really thinking about it, then perhaps the end justifies the means, but that's a very slippery slope. So I think that itself is a very interesting question, and it directly translates to what they're trying to think about in terms of these social media platforms and what their moral obligations are and what's in bounds and out of bounds and all that stuff.
That's super interesting, because you made the difference between the entertainment industry and the advertising industry. And in entertainment, if you go and speak to a public speaking coach now, the coach will tell you to tell stories and to make it resonate with people and to hang on people's emotions and so on. Netflix do that as well, because they have such a high degree of personalization. They also do A/B testing, and they show you personalized thumbnails, and maybe in some meta sense they also test different styles of content, and the ones which are successful they produce. In a way, Netflix are doing exactly the same thing. They might say, we're going to introduce this particular feature and we're going to make it available to some people and not others.
Yeah, it reminds me of an anecdote, and I don't know if this is how true this is, but it was that the way the House of Cards series came about was that Netflix learned that its people liked political dramas, that it liked things directed by David Fincher, and it liked Kevin Spacey, and it basically spit out the formula for the show, and then that they did that. So I don't know if that's true, but I would be surprised if they didn't take advantage of all that user data to guide their decisions of the content they make, and especially targeting to the people based on, that's obvious recommendation engine 101. They even had the Netflix challenge. You're supposed to do these sorts of things. So we know that they're targeting content based on behavior on the platform.
Exactly. And Netflix is interactive. And as you say, they are optimizing for engagement in exactly the same way. So the goals on Facebook are engagement, growth, and advertising. And on Netflix, presumably, it's exactly the same without the advertising. But anyway, Yannick Lightspeed Kilcher has just joined us. And just to fill you in, Yannick, Andy led by saying that he was a little bit jarred by the experience of the film because it was just as persuasive and almost as bad as the thing that they were talking about. And then Zach came in and said, well, basically, there's very little difference between the advertising industry and the entertainment industry. They're all trying to derange your attention. So what was your take, Yannick?
Yeah, ultimately, it's an attention economy, right? Since a few years, we have never been bored again. Like, I remember the experience of boredom from my childhood. I think I was never bored in the last 5 years. And this might be because I've grown up a little and have more stuff to do, more stuff to think about, but also because all our time is filled. And so ultimately, attention has become the sparse good. And I agree, like the entertainment industry, as well as the advertisement industry, they're all after this attention. Of course, they're going to find some hacks in that. Of course, humans aren't perfect. You're going to find some hacks in that, and that's just my overarching thought. And that it's fundamentally the way we are right now. Our attention is a limited good.
But now it's mediated through Facebook, so that seems to be quite a big step.
Yeah, of course, and I think everyone kind of feels the same in that we're all uneasy that these 2 or 3 or 4 companies hold our attention collectively in their hands, and they could potentially manipulate that to do all sorts of things. And there's multiple takes here. The biggest one I feel is that they cannot be infinitely evil because ultimately they're bound by, let's say, the market, and ultimately they run a free service. Most of these companies do, except Netflix, let's say, but Facebook and all these advertisement driven, they run a free service and they're banking on these ads. And I always think that people are more greedy than they are evil. At least most people are. They would rather enrich themselves a lot rather than put everyone else down if they have the choice. So they'd rather take the most money in an unbiased way than be nefarious and be like, I'm going to grab your attention. At least that's, I see the potential and the uneasiness we have with all of this monopolizing of attention. But on the other hand, you have to think about that these companies are pulled by a lot of forces that are to a large part out of their control and kind of regulate the thing a bit.
Interesting. One lady in the film made a particularly hyperbolic statement. She said that it's a marketplace which trades in human futures, and everything you do is monitored. They know if you're depressed, if you're introverted, they know your personality type. There's almost no supervision. They know how long you're looking at the photos. They know if you're lonely. Is that just hyperbole, Andy?
I guess I don't work for the Facebooks, so I couldn't tell you if they could determine whether I'm happy or sad on a given day. I find it a little bit of a stretch for that determination to really be that effective. And mainly it comes down to, I think, each individual's use of those platforms. I personally am not a big social media user. I don't really post a huge amount of stuff. So the amount of information that various social media companies have on me to make decisions about me, frankly, it goes to show in the sorts of adverts that I see that are very, very rarely related to the things that I care about. So clearly I'm doing something good in terms of not giving away those crucial nuggets of information. And I think that is something that maybe the film tries to put across in trying to educate the viewer on the motivations and some of the tactics used by not only the social media companies themselves, but also the advertisers and other users of the social media platforms in order to grab our attention and change our minds about things and make us act in ways that they would find advantageous. Because, and I think this was one of the quotes is that someone in the film mentioned, by equipping people with the knowledge about how they are being abused or being attacked by these platforms, it gives those same people the ability to be alert and to be defensive against that. And I think maybe us on the call here, I think we mentioned earlier, we're probably more familiar with these things already. So we're aware of them and we can take steps to maybe not give away quite so much personal information or cautious about what we share, or just be very cognizant that the messages that we're showing on our screens are maybe not always completely what they seem. And maybe that's the purpose of the film. I said before, I don't think the film worked for me, but for others who are potentially more easily swayed in this particular area because they know less about the technology, maybe this film did help to educate them on the technology and the motivations and help make them better equipped to defend themselves against those kind of tactics in the future.
But as you said, they the same tactics to tell the message, which was a little bit ironic. But you did say something interesting, which is it possible for us to build an immunity to this? Can we inoculate ourselves against this? And a lot of this, it falls back on our free will. Should we be allowed to gamble or take drugs? Because some people can recreationally enjoy these things, but they can still pull themselves back out of it. Some people clearly develop a problem with addiction on these platforms. What do you think, Zach?
Yeah, very interesting question. I think the analogy of addiction and drugs is a pretty good one, because I'm talking to a friend of mine on a related topic of content moderation on Facebook and the ethics of that. And he's very much on the kind of libertarian freedom first thing. But you do have these questions. If someone wants to see conspiracy related content, who are we to say no, right? Because this is presumably a free society and the internet and all that stuff. But on the other hand, just because people want heroin, we don't let them have access to it as much as they want, because there's like a line somewhere, and the question is, where should it be drawn? And there's a spectrum, right? There's not like an obvious answer to that. And I think when there's addiction involved, when there's harm that can be traced back to these sorts of things, then it raises serious questions. But the answers are not at all obvious of how we draw this line for such a huge spectrum of content. Like some of the easy ones are like, we don't want our platform to help spread terrorism rhetoric and propaganda. Like that one's pretty well slam dunk. Right? They also make a determination on like nudity and pornography, that they've decided that's not the type of content they want on their platforms. And I think most people would agree that they should have the right to be able to make that determination. But then when you're talking about like, whether a political statement is misleading or harmful, like it gets really squishy there. And I don't know who should be in charge, if anyone, for making those sorts of calls, because it's so dangerous to give that sort of power to people.
And I think even the examples you gave there of things that were obviously bad and undesirable on a platform, terrorism. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. How do you decide who is the terrorist and who is the freedom fighter? Nudity. What about art? There's many aspects of art that have nudism in them. Where do you draw the line? I think each individual will draw the line in a different place. And as one of the fundamental challenges that our society has, and by extension the social media companies, is where do you draw that line? And to your point, Zach, who even has the authority to draw that line? Who do we want to have that power? Because that is quite a big power. It's one thing where you draw the line between what is art and what is nudity, but the line that you draw between what is terrorism versus what is an activist or a freedom fighter, that has obviously far more significant consequences, right?
There was a wonderful quote in the film. The data scientist lady said that the best proxy for truth at the moment is a human click. They have no idea of knowing what is true and what is false. As a separate thing, we seem to be moving into an ultra relativist idea now that there is no such thing as objective truth, and that reality is constructed from language and then by structures of power in society and so on. So in a way, Facebook is the manifestation of that, because it's the ultimate atomized reality. It's your own reality. It's a fractured or differential reality. Everyone who logs into Facebook sees their own reality.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes from the film was a guy saying, "It feels like the entire world has gone crazy, but I can't tell whether this is an artifact of this system where like really nothing has changed and it's just surfacing the stuff that makes me feel like it's gone crazy, or perhaps it actually has gone crazy and something's new here." And the really scary part is you can't tell the difference, right? Because for me, I have such a hard time telling the difference between trying to keep my thumb on the pulse of what society at large thinks about particular topics, because I find that like I'll have some narrative in my head that makes sense to me, and then I'll read something that sort of challenges that, and then I'll start investigating that thread of like the devil's advocate piece. And then it seems every time I sign in to YouTube or whatever where I was researching these things, now I'm just like flooded with more content on those threads. So I don't know if there's been a pendulum starting to shift with the general consensus of society, or whether this is just targeting. And the fact that you're in the middle of this whirlpool and can't tell the difference, I don't know how to solve that as an individual.
Yeah, I feel this is especially the topic of these filter bubbles. I think it's been around for 10 years or so or more, but I think it becomes more and more pronounced as just you have to actively go out and try to disconfirm your story. I feel that is the thing that none of these companies do for you, because it's just not profitable, right? Because you get your cognitive dissonance and so on. I think it's still possible that you can get a feeling for what's going on by simply, you go out and you really try to make the case against yourself. And that's hard because you are you and you kind of want something to be true, but still you go and you try, and at sometimes you find something where you'll be like, yeah, maybe I was wrong, and other times you're more than not you were probably right because you are you and you're the smartest person ever. But I feel you have to actively do this, and you are not encouraged by any of these attention economy driven companies to do that. So as a libertarian, and I feel that it's interesting because in this point I feel libertarians are arguing against libertarians, because you have the libertarians who say on Facebook everything, who's to say what's nudity and what's not. So, and it's very dangerous, what you said, right? It's very dangerous to give someone that power. And the other libertarians say Facebook is a private company, they can do whatever they want, so you just make your own Facebook. It's in a bizarre way. It's like free market enthusiasts versus ultra free market enthusiasts. I don't know what to say to that.
I think, Yannick, you call out a really cool point there around we have to go out of our way in order to disprove ourselves, in order to arrive at what is actually the truth. And yeah, the various social media platforms do very little, if anything, to actually force that upon you. But in their defense, if we take social media companies out of this a second, when it comes to newspapers or TV shows or news channels or conversations that you have with your mates down the pub, how often do you go out of your way in those situations to try and play devil's advocate and dissuade yourself around your opinions? It's just not a natural thing that we do as humans. And I think that's where these social media platforms actually have a great possibility to bring that depth of different perspective to us in a way that probably isn't available in many other mechanisms of social interaction or media. They have this amazing ability that they could do that, but they aren't at the moment. How would users actually react to that is another big question mark. I don't know, but I think that's a power that is not being utilized, and it should be.
How much self-determination do you think we actually have? Because one of the wonderful things about YouTube in particular is you can just start looking at videos of, I don't know, dogs or machine learning or something, and it learns so quickly. And my YouTube feed, I'm almost embarrassed to show other people because it's a scary representation of me. I mean, clearly I see it as an invasion of my privacy in many ways. So it's so easy for people to break out of that basin of attraction if they want to. But the thing is, people don't, because there is that little bit of cognitive dissonance, as Yannick called it out. And because they are myopically optimizing on this objective, which is engagement or growth or advertising, there's no incentive really for them to help people break out of that basin of attraction.
Yeah, I feel like the film touched on the ad thing, but a lot of them are like, in the very beginning of the film, they asked them, well, what's the core problem? And maybe it was just crafty editing, but it was just like a bunch of people looking up and thinking, trying, like, grasping at straws. But I think very clearly, unless I'm being overly simplistic, the problem is the ad model. It's that Netflix is trying to basically make you happy, but Netflix isn't paid more if you watch more. They're paid based on subscriptions. So whether you watch an hour a day or 10 hours a day, they don't really care. Actually, they might even prefer you to watch an hour a day, right? Because it's less strain on their infrastructure and all that stuff. Whereas these ad-driven businesses, they're incentivized to get you as much and as long as possible. They want as many hours of your day as they possibly can. And to me, that's where the incentives really start breaking down. It also, the incentives for micro-targeting are baked in with the advertising model. These are, out of 1 million people, these are the 1,000 that bought this thing from me, this widget. So give me more people like this. And then they build out all the infrastructure for micro-targeting. So to me, that's like the core problem, that there's these incentives, they built this technology to satisfy those, and then those technologies can be weaponized for other purposes, aside from advertising, political manipulation, so on and so forth. And then that's where it gets like really sketchy. Right? But I don't know, they didn't spend much time talking about if there are alternatives to the ad model to finance these platforms, or whether there's a way to tweak it so that the incentives are aligned slightly differently.
The problem is people don't want to pay for anything. And at the end of the film, they were almost taking a step towards having a go at capitalism. They said it's because of the profit motive. And unfortunately, if you take this argument to its extreme, it will just say, well, it's immoral for companies to make profit. So what do you do? Because whenever you have some kind of objective, you will always have perverse incentives and you'll have shortcuts and so on. But they said something interesting in the film. They said that we thought that AI would overwhelm human strengths, but it actually undermined our vulnerabilities.
That says nothing.
They were saying via distraction and using our dopamine and reward systems, and we don't have stopping cues. The technology never stops talking to us, and we need social approval, and we can only hold a certain number of things in our working memory, and there's a currency of likes, and we want as many likes as possible, and so on. So these are very human features that they are undermining using this almost game theoretical adversarial attack on our brain.
You can just reframe it as saying it's overwhelming our strength to control ourselves. frame it however you want.
Yeah, I gotta say, I don't think the algorithms are really that smart. I don't think they are intentionally undermining our abilities. The algorithms are pretty dumb.
I think that was his point, though. That
Yeah.
He's saying that we haven't actually developed AI. The algorithms are just looking at really simple statistical patterns between actions on the system and things that we've done before. And just those simple patterns are enough to undermine us and manipulate us.
Yeah, quite possibly. I think it depends on the nature of the content as well, and how much involvement there is from human beings in that process. So again, in the film, the algorithm was portrayed as being three guys who are like pressing buttons and turning levers and all of this kind of thing, as if, again, very emotive, as if there's a conscious being that is tuned into you as an individual, that is playing you. But it's really not that smart. And sure, if you then add in a bunch of humans that have ulterior or malicious motives, then I think they can use those algorithms in a negative way. But the algorithms themselves are completely agnostic to the information that they're processing.
But that's the beauty of it, that the algorithms are dumb, but it's like death by 1,000 cuts, because when you have the liquidity of millions of people using social media, then they gave the example, you could be a foreign hostile government and you don't need to send your planes and bombers over to the States anymore. Facebook actually gives you the tools. You can log into their platform and you can do advertising and you can persuade people from home without having to do anything.
Yeah, again, it's like, where do you draw the line? So advertising toothpaste is fine, but advertising regime change is clearly not great. And there's a whole grey, messy area in between, right?
Let's talk a little bit about some of the conspiracy theories on there, right? So there are things like chemtrails and Pizzagate and Silver Solution and QAnon and so on. And there's quite an interesting thing. I call it the package deal concept. So I think Facebook learns that if you like one conspiracy theory, you're quite likely to subscribe to other ones as well. And it's almost like a gateway, isn't it? So you just get drawn into this world of misinformation and conspiracy. Is that just because these people are feeble-minded, or are they being manipulated?
Well, I remember YouTube in the early days. It was awesome. Like, it was, Nazis had UFOs and all types of stuff. It was great. And yeah, once you watched one, all these others popped up, and it was fantastic. But it was not like I'm now running around saying birds aren't real or something. Like, birds aren't real. But all the other conspiracy theories are clearly. I can do the same thing. Where is it entertainment? Because it's entertainment. Where is it a free market of ideas? Because you're very quick to label something as a conspiracy theory once the consensus is that we need to weed out the conspiracy theories. Once we as humanity, we come together and be like, yeah, okay, even if it's cool for entertainment, they're actually harmful, so no more conspiracy theories. And then as soon as you don't like something, you be like, conspiracy theory. And you have, it's the same with like fake news, like, ooh, fake news. Okay, so you had situations where it was like clearly a problem on Facebook and whatnot. People would just make up news stories, like just straight make them up to clearly target some kind of political subgroup. It was like, this type of ethnic person with this job killed this other type, this children from this other type of person, and laughed and burned whatever symbol. And that's, okay, fake news. So we agree, let's weed out fake news. But now you can call whatever you don't like fake news. So because this is a phenomenon that in the last 5 years I've encountered so often. It's like, we agree something is bad, we'll just redefine something else and then conflate it, and we already agree it's bad. So again, it's so hard. But that's my take on how do you define all these things.
Just quickly on that, there's always been an Overton window. So we've accepted that Holocaust denial is absolutely unacceptable. But now it appears as if, for example, if you're a Nazi, you should be thrown off the platform. There's no question. But the Overton window seems to be so small now that lots of opinions which would have been completely acceptable 5 or 10 years ago would now get you thrown off the platform.
I don't know what an Overton window is, but just try and piece it together based on the context.
Yeah, it's the frame of acceptable discourse.
Okay. So yeah, it seems like it's just so polarized right now, and I don't know if this is a causal link back to the social media or what actually explains the polarization in our society right now, but at least in America, it's like there's this frame of things you can say and you're part of the tribe, and anything you say that's not part of that, you're a bigot or you're a snowflake or whatever it is on the other side. And it's just like these different definitions, and then they're online on the same platform, and whenever they do interact, it's just very volatile. And that's what keeps me up at night, and I don't know how to get out of that. But to me, that's the biggest concern, is the polarization that may or may not be derived from these platforms and these incentives, that it seems to just be getting worse with no end in sight.
Yeah, I'd agree. I've seen that in a couple of cases where a group of individuals are talking about a particular topic and they all generally broadly agree with that topic, but one person has said something that is just slightly not aligned to the gospel view of this almost religious-like opinion on a particular topic, and that individual gets ostracized by the very people who they are broadly aligned with. It is quite scary when seeing this play out in some threads online. Am I missing something here? It really is scary, I agree.
I think we come to a common theme here, and that is just this kind of, and we had it with the ad model and with these filter bubbles, and that is clearly people forget more and more that there is a world outside of their sphere of interest. Like I feel more and more people somehow forget that there are people that think different from them that are not completely stupid, right? Like, it's possible to think, to have different opinions than you have, while also being fairly rational, but you simply make different trade-offs on core values, let's say. And that, I feel that gets forgotten more and more. So our question should be, can we find a way to, ideally, to monetize this, engaging people with these different points of views? Because ultimately that's going to be the only way we can achieve it, if there's a way to monetize this, right?
Some of these people will say that rationality and the Enlightenment values and science are meta-narratives, and they don't really exist. So it's quite difficult to...
Screw these people.
It's rude. It's quite difficult to talk with these people.
These people are clearly people that think something else that I think that are clearly dumb.
Yeah, so I think what's interesting is that if you go into any detail about a topic and you're like actually willing to engage on having a dialogue and exploring the logic on almost any topic, you can find reasonable people on both sides. But where that often gets lost is that whether you have 144 characters or whatever it is, there's just no nuance, and there's no room for like actually talking about what's underneath the surface level. And I think that has driven people to have these one answers for every question. It's, oh, free markets is the answer to everything, or racism or systemic whatever is like causing all of society's problems. And it's like this dogmatic or ideologue type behavior of like, there's very simple explanation for the world, but the world is not simple, super complicated. And maybe there's this adverse causal impact of like, we've been inundated with so much information that our feeble human mind is not capable of dealing with it, so it like reverts back to these very simple explanations. But whatever the case may be, somehow I think if you could bring nuance and long form discussions back into it, then you could see like, all right, well, there's actually people that disagree with me, but they have valid points. And maybe at the end of the day, we still disagree, but I can at least recognize that they're not hateful bigots. We just happen to disagree, and that's okay. And then we like figure out the right policy from there. But I don't know how to get that into Twitter, for instance.
Yeah, ain't no one got time for that there, have they? it comes back to that psychological thing where we have this really short attention span. I even notice myself doing this. I'll maybe open up Twitter, I'll scroll through a few things, and I'll find myself just scrolling. I'm not really seeing much, and suddenly there'll be a picture or something that jumps out at me. It clearly triggers a neuron in my primitive brain that causes me to stop and look at it. We're not built for having that detailed discussion unless we're like really prepared for it. You know, we're going to sit down, we're going to carve out a certain hour of the day to challenge ourselves mentally. And I guess most people just don't want to do that. They'd much rather turn on the Netflix and chill out after the end of a busy day.
In a sense, you're confirming the findings of the film, which is that our attention span is decreasing. And we need to hold our attention because it's exploration versus exploitation. Sometimes things need to get a little bit worse before they get better. We commit to a relationship through hard times and good times, but now we have Tinder. And now we have censorship by concision. If you can't fit it into 140 characters, then you can't learn anything. So what we're doing is we're making it very, very difficult for people to discover something new, because it's so easy for them to find their own differential reality. And the path of least resistance is going to be such that they always just find their own bubble of information. There's no reason whatsoever for them to actually explore and connect with people that they don't agree with.
Yeah, you need to have a curious mind. And I don't know, I feel like I personally have a curious mind. I've got the mind of a hacker after all. I like to explore things. I like to try and find the flaws and the gaps in things. But hey, that's just me. And I know obviously everyone's different in terms of their personality.
But you still have an attention span which hasn't been eroded yet?
It depends on the time of day. Hey, if I'm having a quick scroll through a social media whilst I'm waiting for the kettle to boil, that's different to, hey, I'm sitting down and I want to find out about certain information.
I wonder if it's back when Facebook, for instance, started, it was like the college networks and you would look at your friends and your ex-girlfriend or whatever, and it was very much social. But now it seems like Twitter, and I don't have a Facebook account these days, but I assume it's the same, where it's like your leisure activity when you're sitting on the couch isn't like this innocent sort of information, but it's like stuff that's triggering you on social issues. And it's like, this was supposed to be my leisure time, but now I find myself like all wound up and wanting to argue. I don't know what explains that shift, but maybe that's sort of a core problem. Used as like this, I'm not in the mindset for deep thought. I'm just trying to pass a few minutes while I'm sitting on the couch, but now I'm being triggered by all this like really engaging stuff.
But maybe a lot of people enjoy looking at Facebook. They love looking at the cat videos. It's a little bit like we judge people for gambling. How could they possibly enjoy gambling? This is only bad for them. They don't know what's good for them. We should stop them from gambling. I want to talk a little bit about the depression. So they had Jonathan Haidt on the show, and I read his book called The Coddling of the American Mind, which I thought was a wonderful read, actually. And he says that we've got a whole generation that's more anxious and more fragile and more depressed. They're having less romantic interactions, less driving licenses. He thinks there's a real change in a generation, and Gen Z got on social media during middle school, and he says that the pattern points to social media. I mean, as far as I'm aware, there isn't actually any evidence for that whatsoever, but certainly if you look at the correlation on the graph, it certainly seems to be correlated with mobile phone usage and social media. And there are some statistics. So suicide, 10 to 14-year-olds up 151%, 15 to 19 up 70, self-harm up 189% for 10 to 14-year-old girls since 2009. So it doesn't look good, does it?
Yeah, it probably also correlates with like the S&P 500 or something. Like there's so many time-based signals that could correlate with it. It's hard to, but I'm sure there's also been studies. I would be more surprised than not if there wasn't some connection between a lot of social media usage and depression or something like that. But I'm just not familiar with that literature.
Yeah, there's this whole other thing in that we've been talking about social media as, first of all, as this ad-driven thing where it tries to maximize your engagement, and now about there are things on there that trigger you, but this, I feel, comes back to the actual originally intended use of social media, namely that you share things with your friends, and even that, right, it's often people who make that connection, which I also don't know how much I agree with, this connection between people are more depressed and so on, and social media. That's actually because they're using it correctly. Their friends share things that are cool, and you're just not, again, your primate brain is not capable of handling all these other people doing all this cool stuff, and you're just here, you haven't cleaned the toilet in a while, and you've eaten like 3 Cheetos already. And So it's, I feel it's an entirely different issue than misuse. This is actually just use.
But that's an interesting argument, though, because you're saying it's almost like the market efficiency. You're saying that this is a natural phenomenon, that when people have more awareness of the world around them, they get compressed, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just progress.
No, it's clearly a bad thing for the people. It's just that they are more aware. You see 100 photos of people doing cool things, but you forget that you have 1,000 friends, and 900 of them don't post photos.
But the implication is there are concentric circles of awareness. So clearly, if we were aware of all of the horrible things going on in Syria at the moment, that would kind of annoy us. We have concentric circles of moral obligation. I think it was Peter Singer who had this idea. We only really care about what's happening in our immediate family and our friends and so on. And Facebook just increases the efficiency of our awareness bubble. But the implication is that we should just start meditating and just completely have the blinkers on and not pay attention to anything that goes on in the world. Otherwise, we're going to be horribly depressed.
I guess the problem is that your awareness is linear. You spend double the amount of time, you can process double the information. But the space of things that you can consider is a multi-dimensional space, so it's a volume. And that doesn't fit. You can't say, okay, here is all my interests. I'm going to engage with all the interests that are next to my interests, because that grows exponentially, and you only have linear time. So it's never possible. I think the entire discussion about the social media companies is that they have the power to direct this linear attention into one particular direction of that interest of an interest. So my question would be, is the potential solution to this more anonymity? Because let's say with the ad model, if you have more anonymity online, it makes it less likely for people to target you. There are models where you can explicitly say who can target you and who can't. In terms of free speech, if you have ever been to 4chan, it's not a nice place. It's not a happy place, but certainly it's a free speech place. You can find the most horrible ideas there, but at least you can find them. And also I don't know how to the social media aspect. I guess anonymity isn't really helpful there. But for all the other problems, I would postulate that a bit more anonymity online might be a good solution. What's the counter to this?
I don't think it matters if you're anonymous or not. You can be an anonymous potato and you start taking action in the system and it will still put you into a bucket of behavior. But on the 4chan, are you a free speech fundamentalist? Do you think that sunlight is the best disinfectant for bad ideas, or do you think we should draw lines?
Yeah, no, I'm happy on 4chan.
Brilliant.
I recognize there are good arguments against it, but that would just be my postulation, that maybe a bit more anonymity is a good thing in these cases, because it's also personal.
I guess the challenge with the anonymity, though, is that then there is less information about users for those ads to be targeted, right? And at the end of the day, if we're still going to continue with a ad-based model, an advertiser is going to be less willing to pay a certain amount per impression if that impression is less targeted towards a particular demographic that they're interested in. Yeah, you could take away some of that anonymity, but is that going to, I just wonder what sort of adverse effect is that going to have on that advertising model? Are we going to see more ads? Are we going to see other mechanisms of tracking individuals? I don't know.
I'd just like to challenge that a tiny bit, because I don't think so. Andy Smith, the person, I don't think that's even relevant in their targeting. And the next level is demographic style information. I don't think that's relevant either. The highest specificity information about you is your attentional metadata. And as I said, you could be an anonymous potato. It doesn't matter who you are. What matters is that they can project you into some geometric space which represents your interests in lots of different dimensions. So they don't need to know who you are, but they can still target you, they can derange your attention, and they can make you buy things and waste time on the platform.
Sure, I guess it comes back to, Yannick, what your kind of definition of anonymous was there. Is it in terms of, hey, there's a identity that knows everything about me apart from who I am. That's one flavor of being anonymous. Or is it a case of every single interaction I have with a social media platform is effectively created in its own, almost like bubble, its own identity shell, and therefore there is no connected metadata to that?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I know there are all these models. And I see your point. Obviously, the market force right now is clearly in the direction of the more the advertiser knows about you, the more they like it, the more they're going to pay for it. And I see where the pull is. It just, if we want to solve this problem, we have to think about ways to make money in a different route. I can't imagine this problem is going to be solved in any other way, because what do you want to do? Regulate stuff? That's never going to work. We know that is not going to work. So yeah, I'm not sure.
You say that, but a number of the social media companies are actually actively asking for government regulation, because I think they've reached the point where they realize they don't want to be the ones accountable for making some of these big decisions around, hey, where do we draw that line between what's acceptable and what's not? So they're almost asking for that regulation, right?
The cynical libertarian would say that if you have a monopoly, you want the government to regulate you, because that makes it much harder for your competitors to catch up, because market entry has just become impossible, because you'd have to comply with all the regulations. That's what one would say. Actually, I have a question for you, Andy. I just hear things, right? And I hear things that nowadays, let's say the ultra classic, when I hack into the system, like this SQL injection, whatnot, is such a small part of the security job, and actually the biggest vulnerability are the people, or is phishing, is social engineering attacks, and so on. What kind of threat level do you give these social media platforms? Imagine if I could ultra target these people, I would know, aha, I'm going to target the security officer of this particular company, and I'm going to make that guy or woman like really tired for a week. And then, or I'm going to show them some sort of fake ads for the beliefs. How much of a threat do you think this is to legitimate security of systems?
So that's an interesting concept of attacking from using a social media platform as effectively an advertiser to inject content to individuals. Absolutely, social media is one of the big dangers. You're absolutely right. Humans are one of the weakest links when it comes to cybersecurity, because we build our computer systems for people to use them. And so we trust that if Andy Smith logs into a system, then Andy's allowed to do all these different things. The problem comes if Andy Smith is foolish and clicks on a link and a hacker's then able to get his username and password. And then as far as the system is concerned, it's just serving all those normal requests for what it thinks is Andy Smith, but of course it's a hacker. And social media is a great way to find out information about an individual. So that could be to make a phishing campaign a lot more convincing. So maybe Andy likes, I don't know, is really likes cycling. So a good phishing campaign might be, oh, hey, Andy, we've got a discount on high range bikes, 20% discount just for you, or something along these lines. I'm more likely to click on them. We also see quite a lot of activity on LinkedIn. Obviously, LinkedIn being the social media platform for business people. And I think a lot of people perceive it as a safer place because it's business, it's very formal. There's no silly cat videos on LinkedIn, so it must be safe. But there are many very funded and very capable adversaries that are creating fake LinkedIn profiles to connect with individuals to find out, okay, who are you connected to? And so, again, they can use that information to increase the likelihood of a phishing email being successful, because instead of a phishing email coming from some random person that you've never heard of, it comes from, oh, actually, your boss, because you've given away your LinkedIn or given away a connection to your LinkedIn profile, so someone can see who your boss is. So yeah, absolutely. We do quite a lot of activities in the areas where I work to try and educate people around good social media use. We even undertake some digital footprinting activities where we will, as ethical hackers, basically go out and do some searches on social media sites to try and find the exact information that hackers will try and find, and then play it back to these individuals, these particularly kind of high net worth individuals or executives, just to show them, hey, this is the sort of stuff that is very easy for attackers to present to you. Basically, be on the lookout for it. It's not that often that a attack will target the terminal target of a particular attack straight off, because that individual or that company or that system is likely to be quite high value and therefore defended. So we actually see quite a lot of attacks start off by targeting far lower seniority employees. So maybe just a generic accounts processing person who, at a fairly low rung in an organization. And through the compromise of that individual, that's the first foot in the door for then an attacker to then expand outwards, to move laterally, either through computer systems or through those social connections.
Yeah, thanks. I have a really hard time imagining the job of a security expert today, and that makes it a lot clearer.
That's great. Yeah, it's there's a lot of different attack vectors out there, and that's part of the challenge. We struggle to plug them all, so it comes down to risk management. It's like, what are the most likely ways for attackers to get in and achieve their objectives, and we focus our attention on those.
Do you think it's a security risk having your information on these systems at all? And what happens if we have a dystopian government in 20 years' time and they retrospectively look through all your data? It's certainly the case now in the UK. They've just passed an act where the police can get access to your data. So Facebook will send them your data, and you need to have committed a fairly serious crime for this, so probably terrorism or something like that. But they will get a dump of everything you've ever done on Facebook, and the extent of that dump is quite significant. It's not just your photos and stuff like that. It's things that you've been looking at and clicking on and so on. Is this something we should be concerned about? Because you can't really live off the grid anymore. You need to be on LinkedIn just to be employable.
Yeah, I would agree. It is something to worry about. Let's face it. Do you know what you were doing on Thursday, the 12th of February, 2016? You can't remember, can you? But I bet Facebook knows what you're doing. There'll be something that you were doing around that time that maybe you would have posted about, and it's a scary proposition that our social media accounts, our digital accounts in general, are just our calendar on our mobile phone knows more about us than we know about it ourselves, because our memory is fragile, whereas a computer's memory will last as long as it can.
But who are you, though? This is what worries me a tiny bit, because I resent this idea that people are morally responsible for things that they did 20 years ago or so. And as you say, there's this panopticon now where every single action that you take is monitored and recorded. And the argument for privacy is that you need to have privacy away from the judgmental eyes of others to discover yourself. Because remember, we said self-determination is important. You need to discover yourself and figure out who you are, and you need to have the autonomy and freedom to change who you are, and you shouldn't necessarily be judged for who you were.
True, but that's a societal challenge, nothing to do with technology.
But I think the technology makes it very difficult to have the freedom of self-determination if you have the threat of retroactive judgment later.
True, but again, that's society that is laying down that judgment on past you from 20 years ago. And sure, the technology doesn't contain the context around that thing that you clicked on or that post that you made, that then means that judgment doesn't have the full amount of information around it. But again, that's not necessarily down to the technology, that's society, I think.
Yeah, interesting conversation for sure. And I think it'll be really cool to see where we evolve as a civilization in terms of dealing with this, because it seems to me like it's not on a sustainable path, and that we're going to have to adapt culturally, because it doesn't seem like there's any way that the technology itself is the genie is going to be put back in the bottle, so to speak. So we're going to need to develop the tools as a culture to deal with this. And I think the point you bring up of this tendency to cast judgment on people for what they did 20 years ago when there's just a totally different set of cultural norms is like absurd. It's convenient in the political realm. It's also a little bit scary because now we're all susceptible to this. And one of my favorite things to do if I'm so locally, some of the bars show like these old TV shows from the 90s, like American Gladiators and stuff. It's like this silly show. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's like early 90s, these guys with big hair and muscles doing like these silly competitions. And then to take their name and Google it to see whatever happened to that person. And then you just uncover these marvelous stories of this amazing, like whether tragic or heroic has happened. And it's just crazy that back then, no one could have anticipated the world that was to come before them. And then they're making these decisions to put themselves in the public eye that they could have never imagined the consequences of those decisions because the world around them has changed so much. So the fact that this guy was on this silly game show in the early 90s, and now that's triggered something to someone years and years later that can now has the incentive for whatever silly reason to like dig up their life story and see the crimes they committed and they went to prison and all this stuff. It's just weird that society has changed and your decisions have already been locked in and you have no chance to go back and change them. And it has unpredictable consequences in the future.
I know it's something that worries me greatly because the politicians we have now are so incredibly bland because they have to be morally squeaky clean. And now there is this idea that not only are you responsible for things you did 20 years ago, that they seem to be moving the goalposts. So now if you are even photographed with someone who has morally abhorrent views, then you are adjacent to someone who has those morally abhorrent views. And it's almost getting ridiculous. And because Andy and I talk about ethical frameworks at work, and we do recognize that the discourse around what's right and what's wrong is always changing. And we joke that Barack Obama might have his statue torn down in 20 years' time because he wasn't a vegan. So all we can do is record what we think is good now and who said what when. But the thought of being accountable for things that we do now to such a high level of precision, it's like that episode of Black Mirror where they have the memory recorder. And that's just the antithesis of privacy.
Yeah, this like ultra puritanism of morality, it's just not going to be able to last because nobody can basically clear this bar, this standard. So it has to collapse. It's just a question of like, what's going to happen before it does and when is that going to be, because there's just no way that anybody can be held up to that level of scrutiny and pass.
Yeah, and ironically, many of these people are moral relativists as well. So it's a very high bar of reality, but it's one which is only valid and constructed in this particular society that we live in.
Isn't you get into a big discussion about free speech, and shouldn't you let like dumb people just say their dumb things because then everyone sees that this is clearly a dumb thing? I don't know. I'm on the side of letting things stand.
And I find this really fascinating because this kind of comes almost full circle to the conversation that we're having about social media companies in general, right? In terms of how much accountability does a social media platform have for the comments that people make on it? Should Facebook or YouTube or Twitter, where do they draw the line in terms of what comments are acceptable or not? Are they fostering these types of abhorrent opinions or behaviors? And I guess there's probably different levels here in terms of there's the completely apathetic perspective, the completely apathetic behavior of we're just going to have a platform and people can do what they want and we'll just trust them not to do mean things or bad things. Then there's okay, I guess I need to maybe be a bit more proactive and actually go actively out the way to channel discussions in a way that is more acceptable. But it again comes down to that challenge of how do you define acceptability? And that line is a grey fuzzy line. All of us have a different perspective on where that line is and also how fuzzy that line is. Is it a very definite, it's either right or wrong, or is it right, wrong, or kind of right, are wrong, but maybe okay in some situations. It's again, I think it comes back to more of a societal problem than a technology problem per se.
The social media companies actually have a legal problem in this case. They have a definite legal problem, but even the individual, because here's the practical problem. Then it's, well, you deleted this other thing, so you must agree with this thing since you didn't delete it, right? So this is, and I'm not, right? It's like, I feel deleting some things is the worst option. Deleting all the things is the second worst option, and the best option still seems to be, to me, to let everything stand and just be there for everyone to see.
YouTube has, I forget the numbers, but it's some crazy like billion minutes of video uploaded every day or something insane. It's like, and it's a team of, I don't know, tens of thousands of people or something, or much less. It's like, how could you possibly solve this problem without using machine learning or something like that? Which then gets us right back to where we started, which is like the bias in these algorithms, the choices that have to be codified to make it a go, not go decision, because you have to have like labels, and then it's wrong, and do you want explainability, and then do you want to regulate these? It's just a big mess. And it's always been that way. And now maybe this technology has just made it easier, or applying to a different group of people that maybe it didn't apply to before or something like that.
And I think going back to the technology force multiplier point, it then allows a disagreement between two groups to grow at a rapid pace far quicker than it would have done in the times of long ago. That impact is suddenly massively increased.
Gentlemen, it's been a fantastic episode. Thank you so much for joining us this week.
Hey, there's been a great discussion. There's clearly so much more to talk about, yet never enough time.
Indeed. Well, as I said at the beginning, this is the first in a 3-part series on this issue. We've covered a lot of ground today.
Thanks, Tim.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Cool.
Bye.
Cheers, guys.
Nice meeting you, Andy.
Nice chatting to you guys.
Bye.
See you
Take
later.
care. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.